This is a fresh wound. The person turns around and Evelyn learns he's a drag queen named Doug, who explains the dogs in the truck were his children. Then Evelyn convinces him to share his story. Doug grew up in a religious redneck family. His father Mike raised dogs for fighting, and he would even starve the dogs a few days before each brawl to make them more aggressive. Mike also used any excuse to hit his wife and Doug, especially if they tried to feed the dogs. However, he was fond of his older son Richie because he took after him. The dogs were aggressive during the fights, but they loved Doug, who would lie down next to the cage to talk to them and pet them, sometimes even sneaking food for them. Unfortunately, one day Richie caught him red-handed and told Mike, who confronted Doug during lunch. Doug admitted he liked dogs better than his own family, so a furious Mike dragged him out and threw him in the cage with the dogs, who immediately came closer to him to cuddle him and comfort him. From then on, Doug lived his life in the cage, including during the freezing winter, eating any scraps his dad would throw him. One day his mom brought him some cans and told him to bury them to hide them. Then she announced she was running away because she was pregnant and she wanted to give the baby a better life. Doug tells Evelyn that he doesn't resent her for it. Sometime later, Richie put up a sign on the cage that said in the name of God, saying his mom leaving was Doug's fault. However, Doug smiled because he saw the sign backwards and God spelled dog. After Evelyn leaves for the day, a flashback reveals what happened before Doug's arrest. A man named Juan entered an abandoned college building and found a Doberman guarding the corridor. He asked for the dog man and a door opened to Doug's secret quarters, which looked quite nice considering the sorry state of the building. It was Juan who installed all the cameras a few months ago. Now he gave Doug a puppy found by Martha, an old lady in charge of the local laundromat who did Doug's laundry. He explained that a gangster known as the Executioner had been taking money from local businesses every week, but Martha couldn't pay him anymore and she was forced to sell some beloved family belongings. Doug told him not to worry because he would take care of it. Sometime later, Douglas dressed up as a widow and waited on the street near the club where gangsters hung out. He sent a small dog inside with a phone in its mouth, and the dog gave the phone to the Executioner right before it rang. The gangster picked up the call as a bigger dog also entered the club at the station, where Doug has already washed up and changed. He's grateful to her for bringing his things and continues the story. Little Doug had to live in the cage for months, and he got his education from magazines he found hidden behind a plank, probably left by his mother. One day one of the dogs got pregnant, so Doug hid the puppies away from his family's eyes. Unfortunately, Richie again saw him and told his dad, who immediately came out armed and ready to take care of the puppies. Doug immediately latched on the cage door and started yelling at Mike while the dogs barked and growled along. Furious, Mike shot Doug through the door and made him fall. The bullet hit his hand and made him lose a finger, then it ricocheted and hit Doug in his spine. Worried this could escalate into actual death, Richie took Mike inside after dropping a handkerchief for Doug. Unable to move much, Doug put the handkerchief around his bleeding hand and the finger inside a little bag. Then he reached for a magazine and showed his dog a picture of a police car as he gave it the bag with a finger, telling the dog to leave through the hole left by the shot and find the cops. The dog ran away with the bag in its mouth and crossed the town until it found a police car, on which it sat until the cops paid attention to it. Soon a bunch of officers surrounded Doug's house and stormed in, finding the poor boy in the cage and Richie clinging to Mike in fear inside. An ambulance quickly took Doug away, but the doctor didn't remove the bullet. In the present, Doug explains to Evelyn that with the leg braces he can walk a little bit, just enough to do things like getting into bed. He can also stand but only for a few seconds. The doctors didn't remove the bullet because if they move things around that area they may leave him completely paraplegic, which is also a risk every time Doug stands up. Mike was given a sentence of 20 years, but he self-deleted after 2 weeks. Richie was given 12 years and was released after 8 for good behavior. On the day that he came out, a few dogs were waiting for him outside the prison and started to follow him. As Richie walked through town, more and more dogs joined the first ones until Richie finally noticed them. He tried to escape through an alley, but the dogs jumped on him and mauled him to death. After he was released from the hospital, Doug was sent to an orphanage but he was unable to make friends. The other kids were always playing outside, so he stayed in his wheelchair in the library and read a lot. The only person that befriended him was Sulma, Doug's first and only love. She was a young woman who helped around the orphanage and loved Shakespeare. Since she heard Doug liked to read too, she introduced him to all her favorite books and even convinced him to do small plays for the other kids. Most of their props were cheap or handmade, but they put lots of heart and passion into their acting, so the other children loved it. Doug had lots of fun dressing up and really enjoyed Sulma teaching him how to put on makeup because she said it helped him be whoever he wanted to be. Sulma was bright, creative, and had a unique view of the world that made Doug quickly fall in love with her. Unfortunately, one day she left the orphanage to pursue a career in acting, and through the following years, Doug would collect every news article he saw about her plays, carefully adding them to his scrapbook. Eventually Doug became an adult and attended college through online courses, getting a bachelor's degree in biological sciences before getting a job at a dog shelter. When Sulma finally made it to Broadway, Doug went to see her play and tried to approach the stage, but everyone was standing up and he couldn't access it. Luckily he was allowed backstage, and Sulma immediately recognized him. She was very happy to see him and really appreciated his flowers, but she got even more excited when he gifted her the scrapbook. Sulma was so flattered that she thanked him with a kiss, causing his hopes to go up. Doug was about to confess his feelings when suddenly the director came in and complimented the scrapbook as well. Doug was devastated to hear Sulma was married to him and they were already expecting a baby. Heartbroken, Doug congratulated them and went back to the shelter, where he stood up to be able to yell and hit the cages to deal with his fury. The dogs barked at him and when he fell on the floor, one dog struggled with the latch until it managed to open the cage, causing all the dogs to come out and cuddle Doug to comfort him. Afterward Doug cut his hair as a symbol of letting go. Sometime later, 2 men from the government showed up to inform him that they were closing up the shelter under the excuse of budget cuts. Doug pointed out that the budget was cut every year since he took the job and he still kept the shelter up because he lived off donations, so the only municipal funding he had was the building itself. Feeling caught, the men admitted that the site was being sold to a developer to make a profit. His leg braces and asked his new friends to be ready to catch him when he was done. The queens helped him reach the stage and he waited behind the curtains, which opened when he was introduced as Edith Piaf. Doug started singing in French while doing slight movements with his hands, and both the public and his coworkers were enchanted by his voice. Everyone could hear the raw emotion in the lyrics, and by the end, everyone clapped and cheered for Doug, wanting more. The curtains closed and the other queens rushed to catch Doug right before he fell. From then on, Doug was allowed to perform in the club every Friday night. Obviously this didn't pay enough to live, so Doug started a service that matched lonely people with the right dog for company and protection. He also gave them extra help if they needed it, implying illegal activities like what he did with the Executioner. One day while he was cooking, the dogs would bring him any ingredient he needed from the pantry, and this made Doug realize this could be used to do what he called fair redistribution of wealth. His smallest dog would sneak inside rich people's houses through windows or ceiling hatches that were left unlocked because of their small size. Then the dog would open a bigger entrance so all the other dogs could come in too. Together they would steal all the jewelry they could carry and nobody ever suspected animals were doing it. Things went well for a while until one day, a rich lady called insurance agent Ackerman, who thought she was trying to commit insurance fraud. Supposedly every window and door in her house had been locked except for a tiny bathroom window, not to mention her dogs didn't bark. However, the lady gave him the security gas them to hide. Ackerman found the Doberman guarding the corridor and considered shooting, but at that moment Doug opened the door and told him the jewelry was in the safe. Once he had the box, Ackerman took a seat to check everything was in there, and Doug used the chance to order his dogs to kill him. Now that most of his life has been covered, Doug shares why he got arrested. The evening after Doug helped Martha, the executioner and his gang found the abandoned building because they beat up Juan until he talked. Once they were sure they were at the right place, they killed Juan with a shot. The sound alerted Doug of their presence and he told the dogs to get in position for war while he grabbed a weapon from his collection. The executioner ignored the Doberman and started to shoot the metal door to no avail while Doug escaped through a narrow hidden corridor. At that moment a little dog ran by the corridor and a gangster followed him into a hole, only for the bigger dogs to drag him in and kill him. Then the gang split and started to follow the different dogs that kept peeking into the corridor. A guy followed a dog into a bathroom with a wet floor, and the dog released a cable to electrocute him. Another guy followed a chihuahua into a locker room and when he got close enough, Doug shot him through the wall. A man entered the wrong room and found himself surrounded by huge dogs that immediately mauled him to death. While chasing a small dog, another guy fell inside a hidden pit, and when his friend tried to help him, the dog pushed him down as well. Then Doug came over and shot them both. In the corridor, a gangster stepped on a trap and was left hanging from the ceiling for a dog to catch. Nearby another gangster also fell in a trap and got mauled as well. The executioner started to get nervous and asked his men to bring him a better weapon. At that moment Doug opened fire through the wall, bringing down a few men. When the executioner shot back, a bullet hurt Doug's back before he managed to duck. A desperate Doug dragged his body through the floor and took the narrow corridor to return to his quarters while the executioner used the bigger weapon to finally open the door. He came inside and tried to shoot Doug only to discover he ran out of bullets, and the dogs used the chance to kill him too. Afterward Doug and his dogs escaped in a truck and that was when the police caught them.